Hello everyone.
Hi.
Hope you guys are having a great evening. We are really excited to be doing sort of a special edition episode tonight where we're going to be taking questions. And I've got my laptop pulled up here so I can make sure to see your questions as they come up live. We also have some that have been submitted by some people ahead of time, which we really appreciate you guys doing that, giving us a little bit of a heads up and some time to check those out. So we're gonna go ahead and address those questions that have already been asked first, and then we have some, if we get through those, and any that you submit while we're on here, we'll go ahead and get those taken care of first, and then we'll do some of ours after that.
So definitely feel free to drop some questions if you have some that we're definitely open to taking those just in the question box, and Megan will check those. And again, anything lifestyle, mindset, personal development, surviving COVID, the quarantine, just whatever might be on your mind, we'd be happy to answer. And we haven't rehearsed the ones that we've gotten, and then we're gonna, if you have time, we're gonna go back and forth and ask each other some questions. So it's all unrehearsed.
All
you
unrehearsed.
never know
Raw version.
what might come up.
Yeah, okay, cool. So our first question that we got that I wrote down here is from Jonathan. And he says, how do you keep going when you aren't motivated? I like this question.
So I guess I'll start out on this one. I think it's a really good question. I think there's several ways to tackle it. First of all, what is it you're trying to do? You have to really nail down if that's the right thing for you to be doing, because part of the reason you may not be motivated is because maybe your why behind that isn't big enough, or you're not doing the right thing. So really asking yourself those questions of, is what I'm trying to do something that I need to be doing or something I should be doing, I think is really important to really nail down, because if your why is big enough, then you're going to find a way to do it. We've talked some about beginning with the end in mind. So what is that end goal that you're trying to reach? And then making sure your why is big enough to get you to do it. I'd say a couple other things is breaking it down into the smallest step to take.
Yes, totally agree with that.
If your goal is to, let's take something really simple, floss your teeth, but you can never seem to do it, just tell yourself every day, all right, I'm going to floss one tooth, because the thing is, once you do one tooth, nobody's gonna, all right, I'm done. You're gonna do, half your teeth or all your teeth. So what's the smallest increment you can break it down into? If you're writing, okay, well, I don't have to write 1,000 words today. Right. I'm gonna write one sentence today.
Yes.
And then once you get the creative juices flowing, then in all likelihood, you're gonna be able to keep going. So.
Yeah, I love that. And I was gonna say, Mel Robbins, if you haven't read her 5-second rule or watched any of her stuff, she's incredible. And she talks about motivation is basically like a myth. And so that really, it's sort of more like what Matt was saying about, it really comes down to what is the thing that's going to drive you to do the actions. That you're never gonna feel like doing the things usually. I'm just thinking about, even with my experience of playing the violin, there weren't a lot of days, extremely few days, I'm gonna say, in my life that I felt like getting up and practicing or going to a practice room or doing the thing. But when I did some of the things that Matt just talked about, I love that, we called it small manageable bites, what's the littlest thing that you can take on, even if it's just 2 notes, play this note and this note. Okay, once I get that several times, then I can kind of grow it a little bit, a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger. And that's, sometimes you have to master it on a small scale and then get it to be bigger. But ultimately, if you're relying on your feelings to get you to do the thing, that's not going to be super effective. And it's like what Matt talks about a lot, I know, on his profile is, we can tell ourselves a different story. We don't have to believe everything we think, and we don't have to believe everything we feel. And so when we act, even though we don't feel like it, guess what we build? Confidence. Self-confidence, and it's the most amazing feeling. And this is something we both practice on a regular basis. There's so many times we don't feel like doing the thing, but we do it anyway because we know that the goal and the why is bigger than sacrificing not feeling great for that one moment. And like Matt said, once you get started, I mean, like once you're already on the way to the gym, it's not like, oh, I might as well turn around and you're like, I might as well go work out, you know? So once you get started, that's usually the motivator to just kind of get you to keep going.
Yeah, and I think something you touched on was confidence. There's a confidence and competence loop that as you build confidence, you're going to become better at it, which is going to give you confidence to keep doing it. So
yes,
getting started is so important. And then another thing I think if you're really having trouble getting started, this is where you start being creative and using your tribe to influence you.
yes,
Like, what are the consequences, both positive and negative, for you not taking action?
right.
So if you have a buddy, if you have a spouse, like, all right, I've committed to writing one sentence a day, like they better be checking in with you, and there's either going to be a reward or punishment. I know sometimes people can take this to extremes. Like I've heard there's even some programs online that if you don't fulfill your obligation, then you automatically have to give a donation to an opposite political party, and
or something that you don't
want to do. But use that carrot and stick, and use your tribe to help make you accountable for those things. So hopefully once you get the wheels turning, then you're going to be able to be more self-motivated. But using your tribe creatively, I think is something you can use as well. And letting your if it's a goal, like it's losing weight or running something or writing something, like making that known to people, speaking that out loud, not keeping it to yourself. So there's some societal accountability, so that, you know, if you're saying I'm going to write a book by the end of the year and there's no book, then there's going to be some consequences there, and you don't want it to be a negative. You don't want to feel ashamed from that necessarily, but you do want to have that pressure, both good and bad, that for doing what you say you're going to do.
Right. And especially if it's, work related, I think we understand that. But when it's just a personal goal, people are going to start asking you, hey, did you ever finish that book? Or did you ever do whatever? And there's no shame. It's not about shame here, but it is about, like Matt was saying, sometimes a negative thing or sometimes people checking in on you is actually going to motivate you or actually going to push you to do the thing. One thing I love that you also touched on and that my friend Amanda just pointed out is celebrating the victories when you have them. You know, when you have something like, one thing, you know, we think about this with kids a lot, like we always say like, oh, if you do your homework or if you get this grade or if you do whatever, then you get an ice cream cone or you get to go to whatever, this trip or go to a friend's house or whatever. But we forget about it, like as adults, we still need those things. Like that's okay. Like if I finish my work today, I get to, you know, spend a little extra time, whatever that looks like for you. What's an incentive? What's something that you enjoy? Or even as you're going through, sometimes visually watching something like move. Some people use pennies, like they use 1 penny for each, you know, ask that they do, or I've done this with my students. You know, we just have this little thing. It's like a little red bar and it has 10 little beads on it, and for every one you get to move the bead across. Sometimes those little things, in maybe you eat an M&M or something like that, you know, sometimes those little things are really helpful, and then when you celebrate those victories, you're more likely to do the thing again. Or checking a box off. If you're somebody who likes to check a box or do a checklist, once you check one thing off, it's amazing how much more quickly you want to check the other things off and how much more you're like, let's keep going. And you know, this whole discussion makes me think of our next question, which is from Caitlin. And she says, what's harder, finishing or starting a project? And based on this discussion, I'm kind of leaning towards starting. And I was thinking that really in reflecting before this anyways, that starting was harder, because a lot of the time for me, it was just picking my violin up. It was as if my violin weighed 1,000 pounds, you know, or sometimes it's just opening up my computer and sending the first message. Because again, once we get the momentum rolling, then it's easier to finish the thing. That's just my experience. It's not always worked that way 100% of the time for me, but for me, often it's just getting started. Because a lot of the time, the motivation, the momentum, the movement, the willingness to keep going, the people that you've gathered to help you, your tribe, are going to help you, propel you to keep going and do the rest. And it's so much easier than that initial getting it started, launching off the ground. I even think about, it's like the plane, it uses so much fuel to get off the ground, right? And so it's like that, it's that starting, that initial launch that's tough.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably depends some on the person and the project. I was going to take the opposite side. I think finishing can be more difficult depending on the project because there's a lot of excitement at the beginning. There's a lot of enthusiasm, especially if you've told other people, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to run a marathon, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to start a business. And then you're kind of on your own. Then once the initial excitement has gone down, then you have that motivation. There isn't as much motivation, and then you're actually doing the work and you're actually on your own, and you don't have necessarily a crowd cheering for you. And so you have to figure out how to land the plane, if you will. And so I think, and depending again on the project, there can be a lot of pressure to perform and complete it to your standards. And so it can be easy, especially if you don't have a deadline, especially if you don't have a system in place to finish the project. It can just sort of disappear or not get done. So I think if you don't have a system in place, if you don't have a deadline for whatever it is, and habits that are going to help you complete that project, then finishing in a lot of senses can be more difficult because you don't have that momentum anymore, and you don't necessarily have the pressure to finish it if you don't have those systems in place to help you be successful.
What do you mean by you're on your own? Because we just talked about like having a tribe, having people who are checking in with you or asking how things are going. What did you mean by
So a lot of times you may not have that tribe. So that's why it's important to implement those systems and to have a tribe around you. But if you don't have that, then it's harder to do that on your own and keep yourself to a deadline, keep yourself to task. If you aren't disciplined enough to finish it on your own, then it can be more difficult in my mind because you may not have people, if you haven't set up those systems, to help you land the plane and finish the project on time. Because if you haven't made it known and if nobody's checking in on you, then that project can just sort of die and nobody's going to know. And that's kind of a way out as well that we leave for ourselves when we start a project, is if I don't, and maybe it's subconscious, I don't know, but if I don't tell people I'm doing this, then it's sort of a safety blanket that, if it doesn't turn out like I want, or I get bored, or I get scared, then I can just toss that to the side, and there's no pressure from society. Nobody's going to think ill of me. I'm not going to be disappointed in myself because nobody else knew except me. And so that can be a dangerous thing to do if you're going into a project and not telling people about it, or you don't have any kind of accountability, because then we can just end up not basically quitting and nobody's going to know about it.
Yeah, and I guess for me, when you say on your own, I think it's those moments when you feel like you're by yourself. Even though you may have people in your life that you've recruited to cheer for you, or maybe you need to find those people. That's also a possibility, that you haven't told anybody, like Matt was saying, you haven't recruited anybody, you haven't made it known and really stepped out there. That's also a possibility. But I think it is truly those moments when you're like, I've got to do the thing and nobody's watching. Nobody's checking in on me in this moment. It's up to me to be disciplined in this moment. It's up to me to write that paragraph or train in this moment or make that phone call. Whatever it is up to me in that moment. And I have a choice. I can step into that, or I can step away from that knowing I kind of have an out. We call that a lot of the time in Arbonne, we call that a back door. We're leaving that back door open. Like, I can always step away. I've always got this option. But when you tell people and you really start stepping into that place, it takes courage, but it's amazing because that back door is slammed shut. And then guess what? When you don't have that option anymore, you've got to just keep going, right? So it's important, I think, for finishing, like Matt said, to have those systems in place if you don't, and know in those moments of being alone how tricky it's going to be. I mean,
this just sort of hit me, but if you take the biblical example, finishing is much more difficult. I mean, the race, many start the race, few finish.
Yeah.
The way is broad, but few go through the gate. And so, it's easier to start something. it's easy to get dunked in the water and say I'm a Christian, but the road ahead is going to be a lot more challenging. So again, I think it does depend on the project and the person. There can definitely be some difficulties to starting and knowing what you want to do. But if you know what you want to do and then you get started, I think finishing can have some more challenges.
Yeah, so kind of a balanced view there. Like we said, it's not rehearsed. Okay, our next question is kind of a little off the wall, but I really like this question. It comes from Lori, and it's, what were the challenges of moving with a pet, with an animal? And as far as like planning, logistics, and follow through. So what she's referring to here is, if you're not familiar with us, is we moved from Indiana to Florida about 2 years ago. And it was a really big move. We had never made that kind of long distance move, and we had never moved with our dog. He is a rescue. We rescued him almost 4 years ago. And so there's some challenges there with, depending on your pet and their needs. But from my end, we kind of decided who he was gonna go with. Obviously, that would be well, I shouldn't say obviously, but Matt was driving the truck and I was driving the car. So he could have technically ridden in the truck, but that's not as ideal. And if you are somebody like with 2 cars going on, then that that could have been maybe easier to pass off. We were often not in the same place at the same time, just because of him with the truck and some different logistics. So I mostly was with him, and I can say from my end, just the actual moving him part, we tried to make it as comfortable as we could for him. He really personally likes having something soft and blankets. No matter how soft the car seat is, like, he likes a blanket. So any sort of place there was a blanket, he was trying to stay. And he did fine with just being free in the car. But what I tried to do is stop as often as I could, and made sure I had a water bowl with a water bottle and his food, so that we could make sure that he was taken care of with food and water. And then a lot of places, gas stations, and particularly certain McDonald's actually have a dog park that you can walk your pets in. I had no idea about this, but I stopped at a few different McDonald's and they actually had dog parks. So that was kind of nice. And they're really flexible about you traveling with your pet. I feel like even more places of business are trying to accommodate pets, which is really nice, and especially people traveling with them. And then we did have to keep him in a hotel room. We just checked in beforehand, made sure that they would allow pets. He is because of his situation with being a rescue, one thing we learned very quickly about him is we could not lock him in a crate or of any kind. He was not going to be okay with that. He has to be free. So we just stuck to their rules. I think we just made sure that we never left the hotel room without him. I think that was part of their rules, because I think he needed to be in a crate otherwise, and we just knew that he just did not do well in a crate at all. That's just something that it's like claustrophobia or something. Was there anything that I'm like missing on that, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's going to be dependent on each dog's personality, and you just have to be able to adjust. It's not something that, unless you have a dog for a long period of time, you've probably moved with them before. So it was, a learning experience to learn more about his personality, what were going to be some, triggers for him and things we should watch out for. I think anytime you're going into a new environment, even when we moved into the house at Florida, you just have to be very aware, because he's not maybe used to the house. You're not as used to the house. Is he going to be able, are there going to be things that are going to be triggers for him that weren't at the other place, that things that are going to be more likely for him to be anxious or escape. Thankfully, he doesn't really have issues with that, but I think just anytime you're introducing a new environment, you just have to be very mindful and try to be very thoughtful as possible to make it accommodating for them, because it's not just you that is getting used to a new environment, it's them getting used to a new environment. And especially if you have a rescue, you don't really know what back history that animal has that may be a new trigger in a new environment. So just trying to be patient, I think, with them, and very mindful, like I said, of the new people and new environment they're gonna be in.
Yes.
Can be stressful a little bit for you as well as the pet. But thankfully, Zan is usually very easygoing, and he's probably not. We haven't had to do nearly as much as probably some people do
Yeah.
overall. He's usually
Pretty low
very good
maintenance.
very low maintenance.
Yeah, and we had some craziness with like snow and stuff like that, but he went with it. He really did pretty well overall. Okay, so the next question is from Ryan, and it's, how do you set financial goals while navigating unforeseen costs such as emergency car repairs, home damage, etc.? And that's a really great question. Something that I've particularly gotten into is Dave Ramsey, which if you're not familiar with him, check him out. He has incredible materials and courses, a podcast that's free, all kind of stuff. They have a free trial thing going on right now even. He has an app that to help you with budgeting. And he addresses this sort of thing a lot. And his philosophy is, to pay off using the snowball method, which is basically smallest to largest debts, and to have, most of your, whatever you can throw at that debt going there. So any kind of extra income, anything you can sell, etc. And then what he suggests is keeping $1,000 emergency fund on hand in case you do have a situation where you're having an emergency with your car, home damage, etc. One thing that we do in particular is we set aside a certain amount of money every month for car repairs or home repairs. That's just something that we knew that we needed to start making sure that was a part of our budget. And for us, we wanted it to be separate from our main emergency fund because we knew we were gonna have to dip into it. We're gonna have to have maintenance done on different things from time to time, And so maybe looking at what that's gonna look like for you all, what can you set aside? Is it $100 to $200 a month or something like that? Think about, go through and think about what can you set aside and then make that a part of your budget. Every month, that money is going toward, is being set aside for that particular use. And for us, that has been such a blessing. For example, we had some repairs that needed to be done on Matt's car last month, and we didn't have to worry because we were already setting that money aside every month for those issues in particular.
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think you can one, if you have any history with the car or the home, you can kind of look back through the years and see, okay, what were we kind of spending per year on those things. Then also with your car, especially looking at the maintenance schedules, you can kind of anticipate, all right, well, maybe in the past we haven't had to, but the car's getting older, what are we gonna have coming up? And I think like Megan said, it's really about peace of mind, because when we weren't doing that, and then we would have, maybe a bill for either something that was unexpected or something that had to be done maintenance-wise that was coming up on the car schedule, and then you have a few $100 bill that you weren't expecting, then it can just bring a lot of anxiety on the relationship and on your budget because you weren't expecting that. So really trying to be it's not something like 100%. I don't like talking about the budget. I don't like budgeting. I don't like the tediousness of it. But if you don't put that work in the background, then it's going to cause a lot of heartache going forward. So if you can put in the time to create those maintenance schedules, looking at the housing and looking at your unique situation, because some homes, if you have a newer home, you may not have to worry about as much at the beginning. If you have a newer car, you may not have to worry about as much as at the beginning. If you live in certain parts of the country, you may be needing to look, into more winter things, hurricane, tornado stuff. Really trying to be proactive and put that money aside so that, it's better to be safe than sorry in that instance. And then once you get into the swing of things several years, you're going to have a better idea regarding where you're living and your car situation. And hopefully you can be planning even better. And also just on the individual person, if you're somebody who can work around the house, you may not have to budget as much for possible repairs. If you're somebody who can work on your car, then you may not have to budget as much for that. So as your own individual situation is, you're going to be able to be more tactful and strategic about your budget in those individual areas.
But when it comes down to it, if it's an emergency, like my friend lives up in Michigan and her basement flooded, that's a hard thing to anticipate. You can do everything you can on the front end, but sometimes things happen, right? And so you're going to have emergencies. So I think, doing whatever you can to make sure that you can have some money set aside for those things is important, and doing the best you can to be smart and have things in place. You know, if you do have like a bonus that you get each year, or you know you're going to have whatever income coming in, maybe you instead of spending that right away, or maybe you decide, you know, 50% you're going to set aside for instances like that. Okay, so now we're gonna chat a little bit about some of the questions that we have. Feel free to continue to submit yours, but do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start asking a question. All right, so my first question is, what is a recent learning from a book that you've been able to take away and really take action on?
Ooh, I like this. So one of the books that I read recently is called Stories That Stick by Kendra Hall, and I highly recommend it. I don't care what your background is or what field you're in. It's just super interesting. And the book highlights using storytelling, as the name implies, and specifically in a business setting. But when you think about it, you can really use this in so many different platforms. Even like, let's say you're a parent, like talking to your child about something. When you tell somebody a story, it's so much more powerful than just telling them the facts. You know, like, so this blender blends things up and it has 3 different modes, and you know, it just starts to get really boring. And there's a way to include some facts, but put it in a story form that's like really cool. And so she kind of breaks it down into a formula, where she talks about like, this was how things were. And then she talks about an explosion moment where things changed. And then after that, you have a new normal. And so that's how most stories go. That's a super diluted version of that. But that's actually been super helpful for me, not only in my business in telling people about, you know, the products, or about my story with the products, but also about my story with how I came to owning an Arbonne business. Because that's kind of, sometimes it's a challenge to tell your story succinctly. That, especially for me, that's an issue. If you know me, words are just, there's a plethora. So finding a way to kind of break it down into 3 specific pieces has been super helpful for me in telling my story, hopefully making it more effective and interesting for the people that are listening. And think about it, when you hear a great story, you want to go and tell other people that story, right? And so the beginning of the book, she talks about how her husband like never wants to shop, never wants to buy anything. And they go in the store and the salesperson tells a story about this product, and he wants to buy the product, never having tried it or anything, just wants to buy it based on that story. So I think that's really cool. I think that's just a neat way to experience life that often we're not necessarily thinking in story mode, but that's just a super effective way of capturing people's attention and helping them to remember information. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm up. So I was gonna go back to something that we talked about on a Q&A a couple of weeks ago, and it was, should I care what people think about me?
So I'd say yes and no. You should care about what a very, very select group of people think about you. And those are people who, hopefully your family, a few in your family, not all your family probably, but a very select, whether a spouse, mom or dad, brother or sister, and your kids potentially, and your closest of friends, and maybe your mentors if you have some. What they think of you, yes, you should care about. What anyone else thinks about, no, you shouldn't care about, because because we let that distract us and stop us from pursuing our goals. And like we talked about, a lot of times it's a perceived, we think they think something of us that they may not even think, because we can't really know what everybody thinks about us,
right.
Because we're not, especially if you're trying to build a business, write a book, play an instrument, do anything that any group of people are going to learn about, we can't really know what they're going to think about us. We only can perceive it in most cases. And so we have to set those aside and not be concerned, because otherwise it's going to stop us in our tracks and we're not going to pursue the thing we need to pursue. And so even when you do get negative feedback from anybody, you need to really judge, is this feedback from somebody that matters? And in most cases, it's not going to. And the sad thing is, even those people that I mentioned that are in that select group can sometimes still provide feedback that you need to ignore, and it can be extremely painful to get feedback. Yeah. But a lot of times, especially if it's you're pursuing something where there's some risk, and if those people are risk averse, then even because they have your best intention, they can still give you input and feedback that you need to ignore, because in their mind you're taking too big of a risk, in their mind you're putting too much at stake, in their mind you're setting yourself up for heartbreak, if you're pursuing something where you may get rejected and not ultimately be successful. And so I'd say it's a very fine line and a tightrope you have to walk, and you really have to be in tune with what's your why are you pursuing whatever you're pursuing, and if it's not in line with what you're pursuing, then you have to be able to take that feedback with a grain of salt and set it to the side.
Yeah, I think too, especially in the case of if it's somebody who's in your, let's say, inner circle, some of the people that Matt just mentioned, and they're giving you some feedback that doesn't align with your goals and what you know to be right. It's painful to have to let go of that, but ultimately, I like to think about, it's ultimately, am I pleasing God? Does he think that this is a good thing? Has he said that this is not a good thing in his word? If not, then okay, we're good to go. And if it's something that it's just philosophy-wise that we're disagreeing about, then ultimately you have to live your life and they have to live their life. And you don't want to be living your life based solely on something that other people want, because then you're going to look back and be like, wow, I just lived my life based on what other people think. And that's no way to live. That's no way to step into your purpose and what you were meant to do here.
Yeah, and I think you really have to have that self-confidence. Why is that negative feedback? Again, I'm not talking about I'm not talking about sending, not sending situations, but why is that feedback so hurtful to you? If they say you shouldn't pursue X, why then would that stop you from pursuing X? Is it because you want their approval so badly? And is it because you don't trust yourself enough to keep pursuing that thing? Because, again, like Megan said, we have one life to live. You are going to be the only one that's going to have to live with that at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. Everybody else's is just their opinion on your life. Right. And, we each have to be accountable for ourselves. And so the feedback that people have at the end of the day, we have to be very careful on what we take and what we let really affect our decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what's our next question?
Do you have a journaling practice? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, I've been off my game with my journaling recently, but what's typically been my practice has been to journal in the morning. I have a prayer journal. And usually it's just, sometimes it's bringing specific people to the Lord in my prayers. Sometimes it's just pouring my heart out to him and what's on my mind in a journal form. And what I particularly do, I keep it in the morning usually. You can find a good time for you, but that's usually a good time for me. And I feel like I'm the least distracted, And I actually have a limit. Because for me, I could go on and on and on. And one reason that I don't like to do that is because then I'm tempted to not do that again, because I feel like I have to give it a huge time commitment, whereas it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment. I can still pray and do my other things throughout my day, and all that. I think fireworks are going off. Sorry, something outside was kind of distracting sounding. But, finding something that's, limiting, I think, the time and the amount. Like for me, it's just one page. I just do one page. That's it. That's my time. That's my amount. And that helps me to continue to be successful with doing it in the future. Whereas, I'll tend to get really tired out. I have some things I deal with in my thumb from playing, and so I'll get really tired out and my thumb will hurt, and then I'll, get kind of fussy about that. Whereas, if I just keep it to a certain amount, I keep it to that one page, that's really helpful for me to know I can continually do that and be successful and feel good about that time and focus on what I need to be focusing on in that time. And then I do journal for different things that I'm working through with my life coach. I do work with a life coach, and we talk about different things, memories or other things that I like, beliefs that I have about different things. And so in that time, I'll set aside some time to just journal based on what we're working through. And, usually that's a few times a month, and I'll just sit there and write out what that looks like and try to allow that to be as much time as I need. And that's really helpful in my working through some things. Also, I particularly love talking things out. So if you like talking better than writing, I actually will start my notes app, or my voice memo app. I'll just fire it up and start that puppy, and I'll maybe be driving or getting ready for the day or something and just talking into it. If I don't particularly feel like writing something out, and that can be a really powerful time to, in a way of journaling that's different than necessarily writing something out.
Yeah, no, I like that. Hearing your own voice, whether, we often, if we're alone, at least in my experience, we pray in our heads. But if you ever have the opportunity to pray on your own and usually actually speak, I think that can be a lot. There's some power in hearing our own words. So I like that approach too. If you don't prefer writing, being able to just use the technology we have to say it. And if you don't need to keep that necessarily, if you want to keep that as in your phone, that's great, but you can just delete it if you don't need to and move on.
Yeah, and I do that, with prayer, with just working through things. It can be anything that you want. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. So here's one thing that I thought was interesting. How do you balance your focus on the journey versus the destination? Because sometimes you can get frustrated if you're too focused on the end goal because you're not where you want to be yet. And then sometimes you can get frustrated if you're too focused on the journey side of things because, not frustrated, but you lack focus of the destination when you're just solely focused on the journey.
Again, I think it's kind of dependent on what you're referring to. So I guess I'll use two examples. One, some of you may know I like to run obstacle course races. And so I think, you're preparing for those for months in advance because you can't just go out and run these and do so successfully. So if the object is to run an obstacle course race, you have an end in mind, you're going to finish the race, but the journey is preparing for that.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of, it can be intense, there's a lot of practice, there's a lot of working out, there's a lot of eating healthy, and how you make that enjoyable is with doing it with other people and having those people who are motivating you and working alongside you, whether virtually or actually working out, and having that tribe, that comradeship, that we're in this together, we have a challenge that we're tackling together, I think is incredibly powerful. And you can enjoy that by, there's some friendly competition, and hey, I did such and such workout in such time, how did you do it? And you're pushing each other that way. And man, that was really tough, I couldn't get through this. Can you help me figure out this obstacle? Can you help me figure out how to do this better next time? And so there's a really strong combination of working together, of competition, that you're enjoying not just the end goal of that race, but you're enjoying the process together. And you're seeing improvement too. So you have different checkpoints along the way of, okay, the race is 30 miles. All right, well, after month one, I'm up to 6 mile running. That's awesome. Now next I'm going to go for 8 miles. So you're setting these checkpoints along the journey to make sure that you're seeing progress. So you've combined the journey into bite-sized pieces, like Megan mentioned earlier. So you're seeing that along the way, you're making progress. You're mixing in an element of fun and competition, and you're mixing in an element of doing it with somebody. And there's something really powerful about shared suffering. And maybe maybe that's something we can tackle in another one, but there is this really positive, awesome element of suffering together. And I think one of the easiest ways to see that is any kind of physical endeavor, because it can just transfer so well into other areas of our life. So for the Spartan race, I would say that. And then for something like writing a book, you know, you have to be, I think if you're doing something creative like that, you have to love what you're doing. You know, I'm not going to write a book about something I have no passion for or no expertise in. And so the enjoyment of it is learning more about that particular subject. The enjoyment of the journey is finding something new, realizing, okay, I learned something today about this that I can transfer to other people and help them. And so there's power in that, and it drives you further to enjoy that, the journey of it, and not just the destination. Because in reality, the destination is maybe nobody reads my book. So if I'm so focused on the outcome of that, then that year, those 2 years is going to be like just miserable if it's not a New York Times bestseller or something. So the journey has to be in something like that. You are passionate about what you're doing. You love the subject. You're learning something yourself that can be applied in your life. And so again, just like the races, you're setting these milestones for yourself. We're seeing progress. And maybe it's a little bit harder in that instance to have that tribe. I'm sure there's a way to do that. But again, I think it's breaking it down into bite-sized pieces that's really going to help you enjoy the journey. And because it's something you love doing, regardless of if a million people read the book or 500 people or one person read the book, you're still going to get something out of it yourself. And so I guess that's what I would say is, regardless of what the outcome is, am I going to grow from this experience? And if the answer is yes, then it's going to be a good experience regardless of what the outcome is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you brought up a lot of really good points, and I think that's a constant balance that we need to keep, especially when we're talking about No More Sundays. We're talking about going after goals. You know, we're talking about living a life now that's maybe a little bit different so that we can reach a goal, and that's going to take tenacity, and it's going to take that healthy balance of focusing on, you know, like I just was talking about with the question of the journey and what that's going to take and the focus and everything, but also remembering the destination and like Matt was saying, having those checkpoints and those small goals so that you can have some victories and see the progress. So anyways, I think that's going to wrap us up for tonight. Feel free to drop more questions in the comments. We would love to answer those. And we just really appreciate you all joining us for this special Q&A session.
Thank you guys for watching. Have a good week.